Hello and welcome to Module 4. So this week I've put most of the introductory materials, I've done a written summary, and I just want to speak to that a little bit for the lecture, to sort of clarify what I've chosen to put in there. I mean, natural resource industries are the basis of a lot of our, the history of our communities, especially in the rural areas. And at the present moment, the economy of natural resource industries is, I think, important to understand. And I think particularly when you're looking for trying to understand the role or the importance of a natural resource-based kind of industry in your community currently, I think that the basic economics are really important to understand. And so that's why there's so much economics in this unit. So for those of you who have a good understanding already of economics, some of this is going to be, a little bit repetitive, and for some of you that have no background, it might seem a little overwhelming, a lot of vocabulary. But my intention is to communicate what the economic position of natural resource industries is at the present moment, and then relate that to what we can learn from conservation economics, as it's sometimes called, environmental economics. What correctives have we learned in the past 20 years to classical economics in helping us to understand the position of some of those basically old school community industries. So farming, ranching, mining, those kinds of industries. And I've included a reading particularly on specific to how communities can, actually it's a planning reading, again, it's from the Environmental Planning Handbook, but what are some strategies that communities can use to help bolster those industries? And where I'm hoping that you'll go in your shared resources assignment is to beef up that part of the unit, basically. What are some strategies that communities can do to support their natural resource-based industries, to ensure that those industries are a positive force in the community? Especially with industries like forestry, there's often multiple objectives. And then with industries like agriculture, how do you work with agricultural producers on a set of community values and I think it's important. That's why I think it's important to be aware of some of their constraints are in the current economy. I'm on the board of a community forest, and we're in that situation of being, far away from markets, far away from sort of any of those transportation nodes that I talked about in this unit, as well as it's not unusual, but the resource over the last 20 years has been, high graded. In other words, the easily accessible, valuable part of the forest has already been extracted. So what remains on the land is more expensive to bring down, more expensive to log. And so given that that's our current position, how do we continue to have some level of employment, some level of community benefit from that natural resource activity? Now, a community forest is something that's where the community is actively involved with the management. So I guess in some cases, it's happened that community forests have worked to improve the sustainability of the resource, and that's not exactly what's happened here with our community forest since it was established. So it gives me a certain perspective on So what do you do now to encourage employment, to encourage community benefit in the natural resource industry? From the point of view of, you know, farming and ranching, what do you do now when you have so much lower levels of employment and so much bigger farms, and often corporate farms, which may or may not be family controlled or connected to the community in that way. So that's, anyway, where we're going to start is through a set of economic concepts. So the first one, what I did in the outline was list, you know, what are some of the key concepts that I think are important for us to understand in these kinds of industries. What's a commodity? There's a sort of a general definition of a commodity, which is anything that's bought and sold on the market. But I'm looking at the more specific definition of a commodity as an undifferentiated good. Because I think that's a lot of, in our natural resource economies, that's what we're dealing with, whether it's corn or a lot of meat products. If you send them through the commodity infrastructure, it doesn't matter to the end consumer so much where they come from or whose cow it was. But there are, you know, for example, let's take the example of eggs. So commodity eggs will be produced in a large operation, and they're part of a large egg marketing thing. Non-commodity eggs, like eggs that aren't a commodity, is where you can differentiate them. For example, in the summer, I'm able to buy my eggs from a woman named Rachel, and I know that Rachel takes really good care of her chickens. In fact, I know that she names her chickens. And so my expectation is that the eggs that I get from Rachel are going to have higher nutritional value. Her chickens eat pretty well. So, you know, there's a sort of a personal connection. And I realize it sounds sort of like Portlandia a little bit, the way that I'm talking about eggs. You know, there's a section on Portlandia where they go for dinner and they want to meet their chicken before they eat it. But there is something about that in the sort of, one of the strategies with farming and ranching is, to what extent can you do local foods? Can you increase the tie between your food producers and your consumers? And that's part of trying to differentiate what is otherwise in the commodity market a lot of the time. So we're going to commodity, and then within that commodity market, how does the transportation geography work, and therefore how does that affect smaller or more remote communities versus, so where is your community situated in relation to the transportation geography of whatever it is you're producing, is going to be very influential in terms of how prosperous your farming industries can be, or whether or not your town is going to have a food processing kind of business, or those kinds of things that are participating in the commodity market. You have to be connected to this national and international network. So for example, in the forest industry, how far away are your logs from a mill, and how far away is your mill from an international or national, you know, lumber market? Because that's the commodity network. So what I want you to learn when we do those readings and I talk about that, is that your relationship between your place and that network of transportation, how you access that network, what kind of transportation or containers or, you know, those kinds of things, what's your connection to those markets is very consequential. We talk a little bit about technology change and technological change and how that has affected towns. And it's so the basic economics of commodities and commodity production, and some of us just sort of know this. This is why community populations, rural populations are, population levels are declining. It's hard to recruit new young families. A lot of this can be kind of mostly explained just through what's happened with commodities markets, what's happened with technology, and what's the relationship to the spatial structure of transportation. So that's helps you describe the current situation. It doesn't, and it only helps somewhat to help you say, okay, well, what do we do about that? I'm also going to talk about institutional change, because I think institutional economics and understanding a little bit about how those markets, those products and markets connect to political and institutional decision making, and how those institutions have changed, how that affects the community you live in. So this is all in the notes. I'm just trying to give a sense of why we're going through this. Then get into what have we learned from environmental economics? What do we need to be conscious of as we move forward in terms of what part of our resource is renewable? What, how do we think about natural resource industries that are going to provide predictable long-term benefit for communities, including jobs, income, those kinds of things. And without distributing unpaid costs, which is part of environmental economics, without distributing those costs a lot, to the rest of the community as a whole, and making your place yucky to live in. And then the final, I do include a reading specific to the one that I've put in the module is specific to farming and agricultural, because I think, from my understanding, that's the most common natural resource industry that the communities of the students in this class are involved in. I'll probably add one on forestry, because forestry is also important across the South and in the West, so I'll probably add that one as we go along. And how do we think about sustained yield in those industries? And then finally, and again, this is where there's so much in this unit that I didn't put a lot in community strategies, but I'm hoping that you can bring some of your prior experience from community economic development, or you're thinking about the future of your communities. I've put a few examples in the readings, and in the readings I've chosen have some comment about this. How do you preserve farmland is in the Daniels reading. He's particularly talking about urban, suburban, rural interfaces, and much more so than he is talking about remote rural, where we don't really have a problem with how to preserve farmland. We have a problem with how to attract people. And then what are some other, well, for resource industries where there is a lot of conflict over externalities, what are some successful approaches to community involvement in resolving those externalities? And again, the community forest that I'm on was established initially as one of those kinds of institutions, as a way to give the community more control and input in making sure that the forest activities close to the community weren't affecting community water, drinking water, community water quality, aquatic health like fish, and those other resources that are important. to us, as well as how do you operate the forest so that you still have jobs. So I find it a really interesting problem, because its history is so unromantic in that sense. It's only now that I think that, well, it's happened before that the community forest really acted as you would expect a community forest to act in those interests. But it's also happened where the community forest was just considered a license to print money, and became just another sort of territory for industrial logging. So it's interesting to see how community institutions really work in terms of natural resource-based industry control. And then finally, a strategy that a lot of communities and community economic development would start to look at: what are our natural capitals, and how do we sustain those, and how do we make sure that we have the things we're interested in, like jobs and income and those kinds of things, attracting young families. What are some strategies that communities and states can use for those natural resource-based industries? And so we can see a lot of action around local foods and trying to increase the resilience, as well as the economic opportunity for smaller scale farms, so that not everything is in the commodity infrastructure, and trying to increase the marketability and differentiate your products. So for ranching in particular, you have some producers who are producing some form of, for example, higher quality beef, or grass, for example, grass-fed rather than feedlot-fed beef for high-end consumers, restaurants, and sort of producing that in the community and shipping that to distant markets. But you have to be geographically connected to be able to do that. You have to remember that transportation infrastructure piece for that strategy to work. And of course, I am amused by, I also included a little video clip on trying to high-end something that will never really be high-end, which is the artisanal firewood clip. But that idea that you could undifferentiate through value added, through sustainable product certification, through some mechanism that allows you to produce something that you can get a higher unit revenue from, and you can unattach that part of your natural resource industry from the pressures, the downward price pressure of the commodity market infrastructure. So that's the whole outline of the module. So what I'm hoping that you'll do is read what I've written and look at some of the resources as you need them. Again, I expect some of you will have taken 2 or 3 years of economics or economics and policy, and some of these concepts won't be entirely new to you. But if you, again, I'm trying to work with people with different backgrounds here. So if the idea of the geography of commodities isn't like just sort of part of how you think, you might want to read the extra readings. One of the best books I've ever read about really how the commodity markets in the US developed is by an environmental historian, William Cronin. It's called Nature's Metropolis, and really talks about how Chicago became kind of a market center for the entire Midwest. Working with the transportation geography and building a transportation geography of rail lines, improving technologies like refrigerated cars so that you could have the processing centers more centralized. You think you need refrigeration in order to centralize food processing. or else you're hauling live animals, which are harder to haul than not live animals. Anyway, it's a really excellent read. It talks about the role of barbed wire across the landscape, the importance of that technology. So these days, we're dealing with, again, as we've seen in the energy chapter and in the energy module, we're dealing with information technologies and how are they going to impact economics. So just quickly back to community strategies. A lot of community strategies for historically resource-based communities is to increase their participation in the information economy through making sure that they're really fiber optically connected. So that's not a way to increase the jobs on your farms. That's a way to focus on your quality of life and the way that you attract people. So in some ways, those strategies are sometimes in conflict with the traditional natural resource-based economies. You see that really a lot in the rural West, but also in some communities in the Midwest, where you have beautiful forests and beautiful towns, and people might want to live there instead of in a really focused urban area. And to the extent to which they're able to do that is an information and amenity-based development, and that is we're going to talk about that strategy in the next module. So back to commodities. So there's a shift in thinking. There's a shift in our, there's a shift in our reality from what I'm going to call the industrial economy into post-industrial economy. Many of the things that we consume are still, they still require natural resources, but there's some that don't require natural resources. So we have an extensive service-based economy. So apart from energy and water, a lot of our products are not as fundamentally connected to those what used to be called the primary sector jobs: forestry, farming. That's the primary sector. And so what's happened to that sector in this sort of economic transition from the industrial to the post-industrial economy is, I find it interesting. So in that first page, I talk about what are the, what was our understanding of economic base, the economic base of our communities, so that any kind of activity where we could export something. So in our, in the industrial economy, we had to export stuff. And in order to bring new money in, otherwise, as opposed to the service economy, which you can think of as everybody taking in each other's laundry, it's not that anymore, the service economy. But so in the industrial economics, you have a fairly simple formula for what you can export, which is that you need natural resources, you need capital in its classical meaning, which is as machinery and equipment, and sometimes land is included in capital and sometimes it's not. And you need labor, and that gives you your production. That's the production function of the industrial economy. So the value of that, what's it all worth when you're finished, is set in the market. This is basic economics. So you're in control of your productive activity. You're not really in control of what price you get for it at the end of the day. So from the invisible hand point of view, which Holacek talks about, you get price signals back from the market whether you should decrease production or increase production. What happens in a lot of natural resource industries is the price signal happens after you're done producing. You know, you send the corn off, and the price you have in August or September, you don't know what that price was going to be when you planted the corn. And you certainly don't know what the price is going to be when you plant the forest. Or, you know, when you decide where you're going to cut in the forest this year. So it's, there's a number of what are called, you know, how do you manage that risk? And that's part of the institution of the market at this point in time. But let's try to stick with where we are with the market. So the market should signal you when to cut back production and when to increase production. And if you're a high cost operator, it might signal you when it's time to just quit because you're not able to efficiently produce, or what, you know, it should tell you that when you need to reduce your costs or increase your, you know, figure out how to increase your profitability from what you're doing, increase your rate of return. So what I've sort of summarized in the reading, the other is how price signals work in relation to natural resource economies. Now, you know, economics is all theoretically about how people will behave, and people don't actually behave as economics says they will, and certainly not all at once. And so those of us who live in natural resource-based or traditionally natural resource-based economies are often in a situation where people will say, well, we are a farming community or we are a forestry community, when the portion of income or jobs or anything, the source of community vitality is no longer really from that industry. But we have we'll tend to have an attachment to it, whether it's to the aesthetic or to the lifestyle or to the sort of moral content of, you know, doing real work. It's a kind of a mythic attachment. And so, which is to say, people change much more slowly and communities change much more slowly than economics would predict that they ought to. So you always see that in industrial transformation. We're still seeing the effects of transformation in manufacturing in communities in what's called the Rust Belt. People who had been steel workers and truck drivers, and they didn't suddenly become information scientists or healthcare providers. When you go through one of these, you know, market price signal transformations, it's very hard on communities and very hard on people. And I think we know that, and as community development, it's part of the material we work with. So, a commodity. So the theory of a commodity is just an undifferentiated good that is traded on a defined market at a specific time and place. And so that is the price setting place. And so the price that a producer might get is backed up from the market time and place for units of how long it's going to take to get there and how much it's going to cost to get there. And so you have to, if you have a price set at the market, you have to subtract the cost of your transportation and loading and handling and billing and invoicing and all those kinds of things away from that price to get the price that you actually get for corn. So there's an economic aspect to this, which says that producer gets what's left, and there's an infrastructure reality to it. Although not, for example, Chicago might be where the price is set, but not all the actual things need to go to Chicago and back. And so that is one of the things that's sort of, there's a sort of a theoretical piece to commodity markets, that where the price is set and how the price is set may or may not be the way it once was, where everything went on the train into Chicago and was bought and sold right there. That's really not what's happening anymore. So you have an entire set of traders around commodity prices that may or may not be involved in the natural resource industry at all. Some of that has to do with risk management, and some of that has to do with speculation and just kind of purely financial doings. So commodities, and if you want to, I've included a little background reading on commodity. Sometimes we want to use the word commodity more generally. If you just think about the classic commodities, are those things that have a standardized quality, place, and time, and are traded on a national or international market, the kind of prices you read in the paper. And then there's, you know, things that have some of the qualities of commodities and don't have others. And one of the things I think of is firewood, because there is no international trade in firewood, but it has some of the aspects of commodities. Consumers in a given firewood market, which is generally quite regionally constrained, it has to be where people use firewood, and people might prefer to get a load of birch and hardwoods over a load of pine, stuff that's going to goo up your chimney, pine, spruce, those kinds of things. So you get a, you know, in a little area, you might, you know, you have a unit, which is for firewood, which is a cord, and then within that area, you have a sort of a price per cord. And one of the things about an uncontrolled commodity market is that are you really getting a cord? Are you really getting the quality that you are paying the premium for? Or, you know, are you really getting a full cord of what you ordered for the regular price? And so you can see when you have a more limited sense of a commodity market, some of the other things that are controlled on the large commodity market are not controlled. And those have to do with, well, quality, time. Are they really going to deliver it when they say they're going to deliver it? And so what you do in those markets, and what, you know, people used to do, is you have to deal with the person. You know, you have to understand who will get you your firewood when you need it, and who delivers a full cord when they charge you for a cord. So you have to know some of the more transactional pieces, which in the mechanization and the organization of the international commodity market, those things are controlled. Actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the institutional part, but it's part of the definition of a commodity. So when you're trying to figure out if any one product is a commodity, it may be, you know, all of one, or has some aspects of one, or it's not really a commodity. So what do we trade that does not really have those characteristics? Anything that's differentiated by who you get it from. So, you know, healthcare, mostly it matters to us who we get our healthcare from, more for some things than others, more for like counseling or mental health services than for vaccinations. You know, probably doesn't matter to you who you go to for 5 minutes for a vaccination. It probably would matter to you who you went to for counseling. So anything where you have a real differentiation in the product or the experience based on that kind of relationship. So any product that's differentiated, the more it's differentiated, the less it is a commodity. And so that is the entire industry of branding and brand identity and all those kinds of things, is trying to increase the differentiation between their product and other what might be considered similar products. So the more a thing is a commodity, the less it is differentiated from other things. And the more you can count on a standardized quality, you get the same thing no matter what. It's the other side of differentiation. The more you can count on it being where it is and how much that they say it is, the more it is a commodity. So economics of geography is the next little section, starting on what page have we got here? Page 5 of my written form. I should really have a picture, but I'll do this in interpretive dance instead. So here's a place like Chicago, the heart of a market, and any kind of railway system is kind of the arms. And the extent to which I can get on that railway, I can't get on the railway at any place. I have to go to a node to get on the railway. So my community might be right close to the railway, but if I'm not at an intake point to the transportation infrastructure, I still have the same distance from that as someone who's over here. So you have a spatial structure of the transportation geography. So you can see how that works in rail. And you know how, most of us know how it works in air transportation. The airport I go to, am I one flight from a hub? That's how it goes to in person transportation. How close in flights and time are you to a hub where you can go where you want to go? There's in the freight world, there are trucking hubs. So if you think about those, what are the units that your commodity is transported in? Those containers, for example, the sea cans or whatever they're called where you are. If you get a container, if you can fill a container with something, you can put it on a truck. You can go to one of those nodes. It can go on a ship out of the Mississippi Delta and off to wherever. So those containers are meant to be a technology that increases the ease with which your product goes to other markets, right? So when you're dealing in commodities, you need to be dealing in the quantities that suit the transportation infrastructure that you're connecting to. The way you see this on the landscape with grain is you see those big, what are they called? Big places where everyone takes the grain to be sorted, and then it's poured into the cars and as a graded grain with other people's grain. So for the visual thinkers, you should be thinking about a network with nodes and connections, and the distances can be expressed in money, they can be expressed in time, they can be expressed in whatever unit makes sense to you. They're translated eventually into money. And the other piece of that is, so the reason that I put in something about a couple of readings on transportation costs is for you to think about what is the cost structure of that transportation network. In my natural resource industry, how much of those costs are fixed and how much of them are variable? So a fixed cost is the same no matter how much I produce, whereas a variable cost varies by how much I produce. So if I'm a small producer, I am going to have higher fixed costs per unit that I produce most of the time, but I'll have the same variable costs. So when you get into a commodity market where you need larger quantities that are easier to handle, there's a benefit in terms of lowering fixed costs to being a larger scale producer. So that's the main point about understanding the economics of geography. It applies to other industries than natural resource industries, and I've included the important insight from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, when whoever George Clooney is playing wants to get some Dapper Dan. Yes, I live in a community that is like that in terms of its geographical oddity. My community is 2 weeks from anywhere, and so is the place where George Clooney wanted to get his Dapper Dan hair gel. So I included that in here because to me, that's a really practical understanding of the situation of many small communities. Are you 2 weeks from anywhere? Are you 1 week from anywhere? That's including it in time. But when you have a small business and you're trying to maybe deal on the internet market or that kind of stuff. But I digress into other kinds of businesses. It still relates to how you're situated in terms of that transportation infrastructure. Where are you in relative to a freight node or a loading node or that is going to affect everything that's produced out of your community that is part of this export economy. Okay, so we put a couple of additional readings in there. I think that's an excellent text on transport geography that a couple of them link to. But some people find freight more fun than others. But when you're dealing with the courier and how long it takes you to get something from Amazon, or if you're an Amazon seller, how long does it take you to get something to your customer? Those things are directly bottom line things. So back to what's happened with our natural resource industries in terms of technological change. And so this is the answer, to my mind, to what's happened to our population, why are all the farms so big, and why have all the people moved away? A lot of that is about this economics of spatial structure and transportation in commodity markets. So as a producer, I have no control over that final price. So my primary, and I have limited control over being able to predict what price I'm going to get. Maybe I can build some storage, but my main strategy is going to be reducing my cost of production. So how do I do that? I have to increase the size of my operation so that I can spread the fixed costs over more units of production. How do I reduce my labor costs? I buy machines to do things that people used to do. What's the effect of that in the community? Fewer jobs. So what you see, and you see that in the Daniels reading, the largest economic business farms in the US are very large. Excuse me. And that's a strategy to reduce fixed costs. It's a strategy to increase market share. It's a strategy to make sure that you have access to those downstream markets. Because if you're bigger, maybe you can afford your own grain loading facility. So, talked a little bit about, well, that's really it. Why do we have those bigger farms? It's the downward pressure on commodity prices. And if you look at it overall, natural resource-based commodities have not performed as well as the rest of the economy. And that's why people are often looking for strategies to get out of the commodity market. But it's also just a sort of a fact that natural resource-based communities deal with. The price over time has continued to face downward pressure. We'll get into how that plays into environmental economics a bit later. So what are the big institutions that, and I talk about institutional change. So one of the insights in the last 20 or 30 years within economics, the classical economics with the lines that we all learned in Econ, I'm hoping most of us learned in Econ 201, the intersecting supply and demand in the sort of even field of people who are willing to pay something and producers who can supply at that price. There's some important corrections to that. And the first is from institutional economics. And that starts to, institutional economics is really just about what's the effect of institutions on that market structure. And so there you get into even institutions within the market, like how is the commodity market structured? What are the relationships there in terms of trading and finance? How do those institutions affect the price points that you see? So something like the effect of speculation on natural resource markets is part of institutional economics, because you know, in classical economics, you're just buying and selling stuff. You shouldn't really have an effect from financiers. Part of institutional economics is also what's the government doing, what are those various levels of how are they helping to set the market and helping to set what part of the costs you're responsible for and what part of the costs you're not responsible for as a producer. You know, which of them are socially borne and which of them are borne by the producers. That's part of set by the institutional context. And that connects nicely to environmental economics when we start to talk about externalities. What's internal to your costs? What do you have to pay for? And what does the community or the state or the federal government provide? And the other part is, what's the role of international trade agreements? So if you have what are called free trade agreements, those will shape the market in various ways. And they may limit or they may promote ways that individual governments can control what happens in the market and what's considered internal and external, because those are the things that are the topic of free trade agreements. So and I have the example I put in there is actually about so you have industrial structures that build in these various industries. And so part of the institution that you're dealing with is how centralized are the people that you're selling to? Like, is there only one buyer functionally for your product? In the example of our community forest, there's only a couple of mills that are conveniently located. And the owners of those mills are golfing buddies. And so there's they have a lot of control, without saying what they do on their golf trips, over what the mill gate price is going to be for the logs that come from the whole region. And they may decide that they, for maybe non-economic reasons, don't want your logs. And then your costs are going to go up because you have to go out of the region to sell. So the same thing can happen in other natural resource-based industries, depending on how centralized and how institutionally controlled your markets are. So I put in a reading which has some basic insights into how markets work in terms of natural resources and how markets help us make choices. And this applies to this unit and the next unit because it talks about some of the choices, say, that are between a natural resource industry and other kinds of economic activities. So I would like you to have a look at the Holacek reading. If you're comfortable with economics, you probably only need to read the last part. But it's a nice introduction to just how does the market work. Supplemental and with a different bent than mine. He does use a different vocabulary for things that are for externalities, but I'm sure that you can handle the difference between a spillover and an externality. Daniels uses externalities. So what are the insights of institutional economics? Your markets are going to be affected by market structures, market institutions like financial practices, financial rules, trade agreements, trade disagreements, tariffs, those kinds of things are going to have a farm gate effect. So the sum of all of that, which we've already alluded to, is just that main idea that communities that were or may perhaps still are dependent for a significant source of their income or jobs on natural resource industries have seen rising costs of inputs as all kinds of production have become more machinery intensive and less labor intensive. So what that means is, especially in the Midwest, especially actually in all of North America, you tend to have a set of natural resource industry holders, even when you have like family businesses and smaller operations, they'll be heavily invested in capital equipment. So a young person coming in who wants to be a farmer or who wants to be a rancher faces a massive investment requirement just to do that. So those are called the barriers to entry. So they're very high barriers to entry. Even just those operations that we see, even the smaller ones, massive barriers to entry. The equipment costs are huge, and people who have had that, I'm trying to figure out how to say that without saying, average cost and marginal cost, but people who've had that equipment for a while have sort of had a chance to pay for it over time. Whereas if you're coming into the market and you have to invest several $1 million in a business that you haven't been in before, it's quite a barrier to entry. So different states have different ways to try to recruit younger farmer operators or younger rancher operators or younger foresters. But we have the demographic, the aging population that we see across North America has that particular effect on our natural resource-based industries. It's hard to recruit people into the industries because what you've got as an employment opportunity is lower wage jobs compared to other things that are a lot easier to do, and high barriers to entry. So you can't just go in as a farmhand and expect to own your own farm one day. That's never been easy, but it's even harder now. So for the communities, again, less jobs, lower populations, to the extent that they're dependent on those natural resource industries, and definitely a decline in the population density across the natural resource-based industry landscape. Far fewer, jobs per acre, if you like, jobs per county from those industries, even when their production levels are potentially higher than they once were. And the businesses themselves, with those higher input costs, from the point of view of other businesses that you could invest in, those businesses, because of the downward pressure on prices, are not they're not windfall businesses. They're highly competitive markets, natural resource markets, with these wild price fluctuations, the boom bust, so they're kind of always, at the tail end of the tail. The dog and the natural resource-based operators are way out there at the end of the tail, being knocked around by who knows what. In some, it can be a trade dispute. It could be a trade dispute that's about something else, and suddenly you have a effect on the price of soybeans, for example. Um, then what are the growing sectors of the economy? Things like health, things like entertainment, things like a whole lot of information-based economic sectors with far lower barriers to entry for many of them, or relative barriers to entry, and different paths for younger people to enter those industries. And so you have a recruitment problem, you have a profitability problem per unit investment, you sort of have those are part of the natural resource industry picture before we even talk about the sun, which we're going to do. So one of the things I put for you to try to understand more of the specifics of agriculture and ranching is I put in a reading from the Daniels Environmental Planning Handbook, which gives you a nice national overview of farm size and that kind of thing. So, but what's interesting, because he's talking about what communities can do, is that most of the what communities can do practices he's talking about are how to preserve farmland and how to keep farmland from being converted into some other economic activity. So that's one of those economic forces. That's a price signal. This land is of higher value on the market as suburban development than it is as farmland, for example. That's a price signal. So a lot of, you can just tell from that orientation that one of the things that farm operations are encountering is that they have a huge investment in land that would have a much higher value in some other industry. So what are some of the mechanisms that states, localities, federal government have put in place to hopefully preserve farmland, which is an important resource for the security and the resilience of the country, that is not communicated through the price or the market system. And that brings us to environmental economics, which the big question in environmental economics is kind of, why doesn't the market work to communicate environmental costs or social costs, like farmland? The value of farmland to society is not communicated by the value of farmland as communicated through the soybean price, for example. So environmental economics tells us that the market doesn't communicate the full costs or the full value of natural resource-based industries or activities. And then one of the major concepts in this whole argument is the concept of what Polachek might call spillovers, and what Daniels, and I'm much more familiar with the term externalities. So those are the values and benefits to society that are not part of that commodity market activity. So the classic example is a negative externality, like pollution. So from a farm, a negative externality is likely to be nitrate pollution in the streams. So to the extent that that's unregulated and the farm operation doesn't have to pay for whatever costs they're sending off downstream, then that's not in their cost calculus about their profitability. So the way that there's federal programs to pay farmers to establish wetlands, or there used to be in the Farm Bill, conservation reserve programs. It's kind of reverse pollution control, right? We're going to pay you to do this, rather than you have to pay to keep the pollution from entering the stream. But from an economist point of view, it doesn't really matter as long as the money's taken care of. So that's a negative externality. A positive externality of something like a natural resource industry is going to be job generation, the multiplier effect of having the industry on the town. You know, the sort of, you can have in a ranching town, you'll have a store that sells, you know, salves and tack and, you know, equipment for ranching, saddles, trucks. And in a farming community, you know, you have the coffee shop, does a lot better business. The RV store for grain farmers, but not for ranchers. So you have, those are economic, they're kind of benefits to the town that the town benefits from, that you know, the natural resource producers themselves are not really, they're not able to internalize any of that value. That's just an externality. So you can have negative or positive externalities. And a lot of these are going to be costs to the adjacent communities, to the adjacent neighbors. So in current livestock operations, Daniels talks about a confined animal feeding operation, or a CAFO. So particularly in places like South Carolina, we saw some of the problems with CAFOs in the hurricane rain. But who wants to have 30,000 hogs in a barn in a piece of land living next to them? It's eye-wateringly difficult to live with. So to what extent can that scale of commodity pork production, what are the externalities that those producers are responsible for? And that interacts with the institution of right to farm laws. So the contribution of environmental economics is just to say there's a certain set of environmental costs that are not internalized in the market, and a certain set of environmental benefits that are not internalized in the market. So I've got a couple of examples of negative externality. The negative externality of climate change. That's a cost to future generations that, from this point to the past, we're not really going to fully pay for. Even if we, you know, those of us who are alive now and have been over the last, you know, all the people that were alive since like 1910 have had a lot of fun with our fossil fuels, and those of us who are alive from now and the babies in the future are going to have to pay. So that's you know, there's no way to make the polluter pay in where we are now with climate change. There is the idea in policy that one ought to try to make the polluter pay. It's in policy and it's in economics, because the more the polluter is responsible for their own costs, the more they'll get taken into the market system, and the more they'll be rewarded for innovative ways, innovative technologies to reduce that pollution. So there's some examples of that, of those emissions trading and those kinds of market-based incentives to help the market distribute the costs for how polluters can pay for their emissions. If you have to buy certificates for your emissions, then you have an actual cost. But you can say, well, you know what, if I invented a scrubber, a better scrubber, I wouldn't have to buy as many of those. It gives you a value that you can internalize in your business for what the cost of your pollution is. So what are the negative externalities of natural resource industries? Well, they can be ecological, harming wildlife, bird populations, streams, ecology. They can be amenity or quality of life externalities, smell, pesticide, you know, pesticide exposures. And the extent to which those could be internalized is the extent to which the price will reflect those costs. The other part of environmental economics the other major corrective to classical economic theory is that in classical economic theory, you could have infinite growth in the economy. Whereas environmental economics says, oh, well, actually, all this happens within a biosphere, and some of our resources are finite. So in classical economics, if you have a finite resource, you just go ahead and use it until its cost gets too high for you to use it profitably, and then you find an alternative. In environmental economics, you say the market doesn't value the future effectively, which is just a fact about the market, the way interest rates work. And so we as society value how things are going to be for our children. So we are going to set up some rules, some non-market related rules about how to sustain our practices over time on the landscape, because the market can't do that. I mentioned discount rate. The main idea is that the market doesn't value the future very much. There's different theories as to why that is. So the idea then is that you could value the future through your political system. That's an idea. Given the amount of economic or financial interests influencing our political system, I think right now it seems like a leap to say that our politicians will value human life more than they value profitability. And I mean life for people that are currently living and someday will be alive. I don't mean, fetuses exclusively. But basically that is a problem in our political institutions, that we haven't come up with another way to value the future. Europeans are much more successful at imagining that life will go on, or life might go on, whereas in the US there tends to be more focus on let the future deal with itself kinds of attitudes in natural resource and environmental areas. So in terms of what are the elements of renewable resource management then? Well, what have we learned? We know that our renewable resources are often part of the commodity market system, which in the current economy makes them a certain kind of thing, which is likely to be not as beneficial to the community as it once was. I don't think I'm talking out of school there. I think we can say that. So in order to manage renewable resources, we need to have some kind of policy or planning or government intervention to help those kinds of resources serve our society without undue negative externalities, without undue pollution or negative effects. And there's things that we really highly value about them, like community identity and jobs, and how do we essentially support those businesses in being better community citizens. So I've put in a reading specifically about agriculture and ranching in terms of what are the policy, what's the economic and policy context of those two specific industries in the US. And it mostly talks about farmland preservation, like I said. It doesn't mostly talk about, it has a section about what are some of the management issues, what are some of the environmental issues that we need to be conscious of in policy and regulation. for those, it's soil loss, water pollution, because over the past 100 years or so, we've lost a tremendous amount of soil, which there's some large proportion of that is much higher than natural soil loss erosion rates, and that's had some huge negative externalities from the soil loss. And it is a depletion of the total wealth of the landscape. A place like Iowa had a wealth of soil which is fundamental to its economic potential. So when you lose that, you've lost a common resource. I know that the soil is all on privately owned land, but you've lost potential for the future. And the market is not sending those price signals in a way that protects soil. So there's that policy room there. So Daniels talks a little bit about some of that kind of policy. But what we're really trying to talk in a more general way is how do we achieve, again, my sustainable community students are going to recognize this, how do we achieve sustainability in natural resource industries? Well, the principle is that the potential of a natural resource industry should be the same every year from now into whenever. That would be a sustainable natural resource activity. Sustained yield is actually a very old concept in natural resource management, coming into forestry, farmland, ranch lands management in the US federal government in around the 20s generally, although hopefully we've learned some things over time about what level of yield is sustainable. So I know in forestry we're still arguing about that over given pieces of land, even though you can see that a given piece of land has, you won't be able to achieve the same level of value over time because prior, all the old growth timber is cut. We have our examples from history, like the entire state of Michigan going to build those beautiful homes across the Midwest. Now you don't really have any of that kind of wood quality available anymore. Ideally, you want, or from a sustainability perspective, you want to be able to have an appropriate mix of logs and lumber coming year after year. An economist, and I can hear my old economics professor saying this, would say, how do you know what they're going to want? But from a natural resource point of view, at least you know that you can only grow so much wood. You do know that. It takes time for a tree to grow. It takes sunshine, water, weather. So you know that, as a general rule, if it takes you 80 or 100 years to grow a tree of X quality, that you can only cut 1/80th at a maximum of that land base every year. And then there's many other complicating factors, like, are you cutting the best stuff first? Which has happened. But so there should be a mix of best stuff and less valuable stuff that you cut. So how do you do that in a way that's economically viable? Well, that's the trick, especially given the commodity industry situation. One of the major pieces that has come more and more into, I'd say, conflict with natural resource industry, and it's going to be most of the topic of next week, is the conflict between those industries and environmental health, environmental amenity, and sort of the general community quality of life. And so in our current economy, those things have a much higher productive or economic value than they have in the past. And so we've seen some changes in our institutions and in our practices that start to express some of that value. Um, let's see, I had already mentioned some of the readings I've put in there in terms of, I've just found them so valuable in my own life and thinking, how did we come up with the natural resource management system we have across the federal lands and many state lands? Forestry, game management, all of those things. So in a sustained yield framework for natural resources, you would have the same potential every year. So back to that image of the economy taking place in the biosphere, what's the major input? It's sunshine. So how much of your operation is essentially solar powered? Like growing grain or growing trees is the solar part right now. How much of the rest of it is renewable is one question. But what level of production, what level of harvest production can you sustain year after year without perhaps a lot of fossil fuel oriented inputs like nitrogen fertilizers, without all those fossil fuel powered machines? How could you rearrange a natural resource business into something that was a sustained yield operation in terms we could currently understand? That's really where I hope we're able to go as a society at some point. So the assignment, which I see I didn't restate at the bottom. So for the assignment, what I would like you to do is look at some of the community strategies that you see around you for kind of the survival of some of the natural resource-based activities around communities. So anything from local food strategies to sustainable beef production strategies to increasing the connection between the community and their food producers, like trying to get it into people's heads that beef doesn't come on styrofoam like originally, and celery doesn't really come in just plastic bags. So trying to sort of increase some of the connections and increase the or decrease the commodification of, there's a new word, the commodification of some of those natural resource products. And so I've put my thing that I find hilarious about decreasing the commodification of firewood, but also the Daniels reading has a few examples about how communities can work to preserve their farmland as a profitable business, that sort of whole transfer of development rights, purchase of development rights framework to be used for protecting environmental values. And we'll talk about some more of those kinds of specifically green infrastructure values next week. But what are the strategies to reduce the commodification and increase community support where those natural resource industries are still really of overall benefit to the community? So have fun this week.